I didn't think my claustrophobia could get any worse, and then the elevator stopped. I've always had a thing about tight spaces. Nothing debilitating, or so I thought. Just enough to make me avoid situations that would make most people a little uncomfortable, like a jam-packed subway car or squeezing into a tiny closet. But elevators were different. There's something about stepping into that small, enclosed metal box and trusting it to take me safely from one floor to the next that always put a knot in my stomach. I managed to deal with it, though. I told myself I was being irrational. I'd even laugh it off sometimes, pretending I had control over the anxiety. But deep down, that fear was always there, lurking. I'd been working at the same office building for a few years, on the 15th floor of a downtown tower. It's one of those older buildings, the kind where everything seems like it's from another decade. Faded carpets, flickering, fluorescent lights, and most importantly, old elevators. I can't say I ever felt safe riding those things. They were slow, creaky, and honestly kind of terrifying. But what was I going to do? Walk up 15 flights of stairs every day? I wasn't that committed to avoiding elevators. Every morning I'd step into the lobby, hit the call button, and try to act casual as I waited. I'd always pull out my phone, like that little screen was some kind of magic shield that could distract me from the anxiety building inside. I told myself that everyone hated elevators, that nobody truly enjoyed riding in one, and that I wasn't weird for feeling a little nervous. But I always made sure to stand right by the doors, as if that would make any difference if something went wrong. That day started like any other. I was running late, of course. I remember spilling coffee on my shirt just before I left my apartment, which only added to my stress. I barely had time to change and sprint to the building. By the time I got to the elevator, I was already a little flustered. I remember thinking, great, just what I need. Another crappy Monday morning. The lobby was mostly empty, except for a few other people, heading into work. I hit the call button and stood back, taking my usual place near the doors. The elevator arrived with its usual groaning noise, and I stepped inside, with two other people. I glanced at them briefly. Both seemed like they were deep in their own worlds, staring at their phones or mindlessly scrolling through emails. I pulled out my phone too, more out of habit than anything else, and hit the button for the 15th floor. As the doors closed, I felt that familiar flutter of unease in my chest. It always happened right about now. The moment those doors sealed shut, trapping us inside. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my emails, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept drifting toward the numbers above the door as they ticked higher and higher. 3, 4, 5. It wasn't that I was expecting something to go wrong. No, that's the weird thing about fear. It's not always rational. I knew these elevators had been used hundreds, probably thousands of times, and nothing ever happened. But that didn't stop my mind from wandering to worst-case scenarios. I kept picturing the cable snapping, the elevator plunging into darkness, or being stuck for hours with no way out. By the time we reached the 7th floor, I was already thinking about how good it would feel to get out and breathe fresh air again. But then, something happened. Something I hadn't experienced in all my time riding these elevators. The lights flickered. It was just for a second, a brief stutter of the fluorescent bulbs overhead. But it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. The elevator jerked slightly, like it was losing its balance, then steadied itself. I glanced around, trying to gauge the reaction of the other passengers. The guy on his phone didn't seem to notice, and the woman next to him was too busy typing away on her laptop to care. I forced myself to breathe and relax. It's fine, I thought. Just a glitch. These things happen all the time. The elevator continued upward. Floor 8. Floor 9. I started to convince myself that everything was fine. Maybe the lights just flickered because the building was old. No big deal. But as we approached the 10th floor, the elevator lurched again. This time, harder. The lights dimmed, not quite going out, but flickering enough to make the small space feel even more claustrophobic. The air seemed to thicken, pressing in on me. The other passengers noticed this time. The guy with the phone glanced up at the ceiling like he was expecting to see something wrong. The woman stopped typing and gripped her laptop a little tighter. I could feel my pulse quickening, but I wasn't going to be the first one to panic. Not yet. Then, with a loud thunk, the elevator stopped. At first, no one moved. The three of us stood there, frozen, waiting for the elevator to continue its journey upward. But it didn't. The lights flickered again, and then silence. Complete and utter silence. I could feel the tension in the air, the kind that makes your skin prickle. I glanced at the control panel. The button for the 15th floor was still lit, but none of the other lights were on. The floor number wasn't changing. We weren't moving. The woman with the laptop finally broke the silence. "Is this normal?" she asked, her voice shaky. I could hear the fear creeping into her tone. I wasn't sure if I should answer. I mean, it wasn't normal. But what could I say that would make this better? I tried to stay calm. "It's probably just a glitch," I said, hoping to convince myself as much as them. "These elevators are old. I'm sure it'll start up again in a second." Seconds passed, then minutes. The guy with the phone pressed the button for the emergency call. Nothing. He pressed it again, harder this time as if force would make it work. Still nothing. He looked up at me, and I saw the same panic in his eyes that I was desperately trying to hide. The woman stepped forward, frantically pressing the buttons for other floors. None of them lit up. The elevator wasn't responding. I felt the walls of the small enclosed space start to close in on me. My breathing quickened, and I could feel the sweat starting to bead on my forehead. My phone buzzed in my hand, but I ignored it. My focus was entirely on getting out of this metal box. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, faster and faster. I kept telling myself it was temporary. We'd get out soon. Someone would notice the elevator was stuck and they'd send help. But with every passing minute, that confidence slipped further away. The thought crept into my mind. What if no one knows? What if we're stuck here for hours? Or longer? My claustrophobia, which I'd always managed to keep at bay, began to bubble up from deep inside me. The fear I'd always brushed aside was suddenly very real. We were trapped, and no one was coming. The first few minutes weren't so bad. There was that initial jolt of panic, of course, but I kept telling myself we were fine. These things happen. Elevators get stuck all the time. They slow down, they stall for a bit, and then someone comes along and fixes it. No big deal. At least that's what I kept repeating to myself, hoping I'd start to believe it. But the longer we stood there, the more I could feel the tension rising. Not just in me, but in the other two as well. The guy with the phone, who'd been trying to act cool up until now, started pacing back and forth in the small space. His phone raised high as he desperately searched for a signal. Every few steps he would mutter under his breath, cursing at the lack of reception. The woman, still clutching her laptop, stood stiffly by the elevator panel, continuously pressing the button for the emergency call, even though it clearly wasn't working. Her face had drained of color, and I could see the anxiety building behind her eyes. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but the air in the elevator felt thick and heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. It was probably just in my head. There was no way the air was running out yet. But it didn't matter. My body didn't care about logic. My pulse was hammering, and the walls of the elevator seemed closer than they were just a minute ago. I wiped a hand across my forehead, feeling the cold sweat gathering there. Not now, I thought. Stay calm. You're not going to lose it. The guy broke the silence, his voice sharp with frustration. Does anyone have any service? He waved his phone around like it might magically catch a signal if he angled it just right. I checked mine. More out of reflex than hope. 1 bar, but no data. I shook my head, and the woman did the same. Her hands were trembling now, and she gripped her laptop like it was some kind of lifeline. I could tell she was close to losing it. Someone will notice, I said, trying to inject some reassurance into my voice. We've been stuck for, 10 minutes? It won't be long before maintenance figures out the elevator isn't working. I wasn't sure I even believed myself, but what else could I say? The elevator was old, sure, but there had to be a system in place for this kind of thing, right? Buildings had protocols. People would notice when the elevator didn't respond to the call button in the lobby. Someone would come looking, wouldn't they? The guy let out a frustrated huff and shoved his phone into his pocket. Yeah, well, I've got a meeting in 20 minutes, so they better hurry the hell up. The woman glanced at him, her eyes wide with barely concealed panic. What if it's something serious? What if there's a power outage or a mechanical failure? Then maintenance will fix it, I said, a little too quickly, my voice cracking. I could feel the tension in my own body rising, like a pressure cooker on the verge of exploding. I need to stay calm. I kept repeating that to myself, like it was a mantra, but the more I tried to hold it together, the more I could feel my control slipping. Another few minutes passed. The elevator didn't budge. The lights continued to flicker every now and then, sending faint shadows dancing across the walls. I tried to keep my eyes on the floor, focusing on my breathing, but the silence was unbearable. I could hear the faint hum of the building's machinery somewhere deep below us, a low mechanical drone that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was like being stuck in the belly of a machine, trapped in a metal box suspended between floors, and the thought sent a chill down my spine. I glanced at the control panel, again, as if, somehow, in the last few seconds, something might have changed. It hadn't. The floor indicator still read 10, and none of the buttons responded when I pressed them. I reached for the emergency button again, even though we'd already tried it a dozen times. I pressed it harder this time, jabbing my finger into it with a kind of desperate intensity, but it was no use. Nothing happened. Damn it, the guy cursed. He slammed his fist into the side of the elevator, the loud bang reverberating through the small space. The sound echoed in my ears, making the walls feel even closer. My breath hitched, and I clenched my fists at my sides, trying to steady myself. My heart was racing now, the pulse pounding in my ears so loudly that I could barely hear anything else. "Stop it," the woman snapped, her voice shaky. "That's not helping." He turned on her, his face flushed with anger. "Well, what do you want me to do? Just stand here and wait for someone to save us? We've been stuck for almost 20 minutes and no one's come. What if they don't even know we're here?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. That was the fear gnawing at the back of my mind, the one I'd been trying to ignore. What if no one knew? What if we were just forgotten? The building wasn't that busy today. I hadn't seen more than a handful of people in the lobby. What if no one came? "We'll be fine," I said, more to myself than anyone else. "Someone will come. They have to." But as the minutes dragged on, my confidence wavered. I kept looking at my phone, hoping for a text from a coworker or a message saying someone was coming to get us out. Nothing. I sent another message, just a quick "Hey, stuck in the elevator. Is anyone there?" But it didn't go through. My signal was gone completely now. Time stretched. I don't know how long we stood there in the eerie quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The woman had started pacing, her footsteps echoing in the cramped space. The guy leaned against the wall, arms crossed, glaring at the door as if his sheer will could force it to open. I stayed near the control panel, my fingers nervously tapping on the cool metal. Then, the air changed. At first it was subtle, just a shift in the atmosphere that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't until the woman stopped pacing and the guy looked up from his sulking that I realized it wasn't just me who felt it. The air felt heavier, thicker, like the oxygen was being sucked out of the space. I took a deep breath, and it felt like I was trying to breathe through a straw. My chest tightened, and I could feel the panic start to claw its way up my throat. The woman spoke first, her voice barely a whisper. Does anyone else feel that?" The guy nodded, his bravado fading fast. Yeah, what the hell is going on? I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the sensations coursing through the air. Mine and to mine pretty Siri. What, was it just my anxiety? Was I imagining things? Or was there something wrong with the air in here? I pressed my hand to my chest, trying to calm my breathing, but it was no use. The walls felt like they were closing in. I could feel the sweat beating on my skin, and my pulse was racing faster than it ever had before. The flickering lights, the low hum of the building, the stale, suffocating air. It was all too much. I leaned my forehead against the cool metal of the door, closing my eyes, trying to block out the racing tide of fear. But then I heard it. A sound. Faint at first, but unmistakable. Scratching. It was coming from the walls. The sound of scratching stopped me cold. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart, but it was faint, just a soft, irregular scraping, like something small moving inside the walls. The other two didn't seem to notice at first, too caught up in their own panic, but I couldn't shake it. My imagination ran wild, feeding off my rising fear. Was it the metal shifting? Wires? Rats? My mind leaped to explanations, each one worse than the last, but none of them made sense. There's something in the walls, I said quietly, barely believing my own words as they slipped out. The woman stopped pacing, her eyes wide. What do you mean, something? Like, what? I don't know, I whispered, more to myself than to her. It's just there. The guy rolled his eyes, clearly trying to hold on to some shred of bravado, though I could see his hands trembling. You're losing it, man. There's nothing in the walls. We're just stuck. Maintenance is probably on their way, and you're hearing things because you're freaking out. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think it was just my mind playing tricks on me, fueled by the claustrophobia tightening around my chest. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That sound, it was too deliberate, too consistent to be nothing. But then, as quickly as it had come, the scratching stopped. I stood there, still pressed against the door, waiting for the sound to return. Nothing. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating, but at least it was familiar. I wanted to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, that the fear had twisted reality into something that wasn't real. Maybe it was just paranoia, but the air in the elevator felt even more oppressive now, like we were trapped not only by the steel box, but by the weight of our own minds. I turned away from the door, facing the other two, and could see the same wild panic in their eyes. They were barely holding it together, and I realized I was the same. The minutes dragged on, blending into a hazy fog of dread and stale air. No one spoke. The woman sat down against the wall, hugging her knees to her chest, her breathing shallow and ragged. The guy stopped pacing and leaned back against the opposite wall, rubbing his temples, as if he could force the situation to make sense. The small space felt tighter than ever, the walls pressing closer, the air getting thinner. And then, a voice crackled through the speaker. Hello? Can anyone hear me? I almost didn't believe it at first. The voice sounded muffled, distorted through the old speaker system, but it was unmistakably real. For the first time in what felt like hours, hope flickered in my chest. I rushed to the panel, pressing the button as I spoke. Yes, we're stuck in the elevator. We've been here for... I stopped. How long had it been? An hour? 2? I had lost track of time entirely. We need help, I finally said, my voice hoarse. There was a pause, just long enough to make my stomach sink again. Then the voice returned. We're aware of the situation. There's been a building-wide power issue. We're working on getting it resolved. Just sit tight, okay? Just sit tight. I let go of the button and leaned back against the door, closing my eyes. Relief should have washed over me in that moment, but it didn't. Instead, there was just emptiness. A sense of waiting. There was no timeline, no real explanation beyond the vague assurance that they were working on it. We could be in here for hours more, for all I knew. The feeling of helplessness returned, sinking deeper this time. The guy let out a bitter laugh. "That's it? Sit tight? That's all they've got for us?" "What else are they supposed to say?" I muttered, more to myself than him. "They know we're here. We just have to wait." The woman's voice was soft, almost lost in the stillness. What if the air runs out? No one responded to her. We didn't have an answer. And so we waited. The moments stretched on in silence. The longer we sat there, the more the elevator felt like a cage. I kept glancing at the walls, expecting to hear the scratching again, but the sound didn't come back. Somehow that was worse. The silence was suffocating, filling the space with a tension that I couldn't shake. Hey, we must have been in there for over an hour before anything happened. The lights flickered one last time, and then, with a loud mechanical groan, the elevator shuddered to life. It jerked upward, slowly, as if it had to drag itself out of whatever hole it had been stuck in. Floor 11, 12, 13. I could feel the collective tension in the air, all three of us holding our breath, waiting for it to stop again. But it didn't. The elevator creaked to a halt at the 15th floor, and the doors slid open with a low hiss. For a moment, none of us moved. It was as if we couldn't quite believe it, like we were waiting for something else to go wrong, for the doors to close again and trap us inside. But when they stayed open, I took a deep breath and stepped out into the hallway. The air outside felt different, cooler, fresher, but it didn't bring the relief I'd been expecting. My legs were shaky, like they didn't quite belong to me anymore. The woman stumbled out next, followed by the guy, and we stood there in the hallway staring at each other like we'd just survived a war. No one said anything. I glanced back at the elevator. The doors were still open, revealing the small, dimly lit interior that had felt so much like a prison just moments ago. It looked the same as it always had, but I knew I'd never see it the same way again. I could still feel the weight of those walls, the tightness in my chest, the fear that had crawled up inside me and refused to let go. The others left without a word. They just turned and walked down the hallway, their footsteps echoing faintly as they disappeared around the corner. I stayed for a moment longer, staring at the elevator, at the doors slowly sliding shut. I thought about the scratching. I hadn't heard it again since the elevator moved. Maybe it had been nothing, just my mind, twisted by fear. Or maybe there had been something there, something I couldn't explain. Either way, the silence that followed me out of that elevator felt wrong, like a weight I couldn't shake. Even now, days later, I can't shake the feeling that something stayed behind in that elevator. Something we couldn't see but felt all around us. It's strange, but sometimes, even when I'm sitting in my apartment with all the windows open and the fresh air flowing in, I still feel like I'm back in that box, stuck, waiting for something to happen. And sometimes, just sometimes when everything's too quiet, I swear I can hear scratching.